The spirit and intent. First Nations peoples believe that the written text of the treaties have left out the many verbal promises, assurances, and guarantees given by the treaty commissioners during negotiations. These verbal assertions are regarded as an integral part of the treaty agreements. First Nations peoples believe that treaties between the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, and Nakota nations and the British Crown is what known as Saskatchewan were negotiated and agreed to with the spirit and intent that First Nation peoples who would continue to own the wildlife as the newcomers were going to bring their own 2- and 4-legged animals.
The treaties are more than promises. They are sacred agreements between First Nations and the Crown with the Creator as a witness.
The First Nations established a political protocol for an annual reviews of the progress of the implementation of the treaties.
The natural resources were meant to be shared equally between the Crown and the First Nations. Treaties considered the livelihood of future generations.
The First Nations retained the right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather as they had for thousands of years prior to the treaties.
The First Nations lands were not to be sold or leased without the expressed consent of the First Nations peoples.
By signing the treaties, the First Nations created an ongoing relationship with the Crown in First Nations social and economic development, the exchange for lands given to the Crown.
All lands First Nations people were entitled to were to be given to them at the time of treaty.
First Nations retained their right to govern themselves. They retained sovereignty over their people, lands, and resources, subjects to share jurisdiction with the British Crown, now the Canadian government.
The land was to be used by the newcomers for agricultural purposes. Only the depth of a plow, about 6 inches, was to be shared. The First Nations' way of life was not to be taken away. What they were to receive was to be on top of what they already had.
The First Nations have inherent rights, such as the right to keep their languages, traditional teachings, and their way of life.
The First Nations' interpretation of the treaties would supersede all other interpretations.
The First Nations were promised that the Crown, now the Canadian government, would provide protection and assistance to develop and prosper.
The medicine chest was meant to include total health and medical coverage.
The land was never ceded or surrendered.
Treaties are gifts from the Creator.
Treaties are to last as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows.